You were just looking at Abbey Road.
Yeah.
That is the famous Abbey Road as it looks today. But back in June of 1967, the start of the so-called Summer of Love, the Beatles released one of their most iconic albums. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band marked a huge turning point in music history. The 13 tracks went on to become timeless hits and helped influence artists for generations to come.
So today marks 50 years since the Beatles released the record. And with us now to talk about Sgt. Pepper's significant place in music history is Village Voice editor and Rolling Stone contributor Joe Levy.
What's up?
How you doing?
So Joe,
Yes.
take us back in time.
Okay.
1967.
Right.
We are just twinkles in our parents' eyes. But the
Quite some
Beatles,
twinkles.
but the Beatles are already pretty successful. Where are they along there?
Well, the Beatles, of course, are hugely
Right.
successful at this point. They are the most famous people in the world. They have weathered the storm of John Lennon saying the year before they are bigger than Jesus.
Yeah.
They've retired from live performance. August 1966 marks their last live show in San Francisco, and that's a major turning point. They take some time off, and then they spend an unprecedented 5 months recording the music that ends up on this record. Remember that we were getting a Beatles album, or the world was, every 6 months. And it was 10 months in between the release of Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's. It was about twice as long as it usually took to get a Beatles album. Nobody knew what was going on. Everyone was waiting for this.
And, you know, Joe, it's a good point to mention this, that when this album, when they went into the studio to record this album, what they ultimately came out with, we were only 4 or 5 years removed from I Want to Hold Her Hand and Love Me Do and those, what many people would term bubblegum or early rock and roll style Beatles songs.
Let's call them early rock and roll. Those early Beatles songs are not bubblegum, but here's the thing. The Beatles take 13 hours to record that first album. 13 hours from beginning to end. They take 5 months to do this. That's unprecedented. And along the way, they are encouraging George Martin, Jeff Emmerich, their engineer, to invent technology that is used on all sorts of recordings made today. Stuff is being invented. A comparison would be Orson Welles making Citizen Kane. He turns to his director of photography and say, well, can we get the front and the back in focus at the same time? And the guy goes, well, I'm going to have to invent a lens and create something called deep focus. John Lennon is tired of double tracking his vocals, meaning he was apparently, both he and Paul were perfect at singing the same vocal and then re-singing it to create a double tracked vocal. It gives you more depth. And John was like, I don't feel like doing it. Can't you just push a button? So they made a button.
Right.
They made something called ADT. We call it flanging today. You hear it on everything in the world, and it is a simultaneous processing of the signal that they invented for this record. And there's all sorts of stuff like that.
So, you know, you've used the word unprecedented a couple of times already in this conversation, and I think people, you know, are very familiar with these songs, but they don't realize that the nature of the songs, the technology being used, the fact that it took so long.
Right.
All that stuff is normal now, but it was not normal then.
We grow up with this stuff. This is lullaby music to us, right? Our parents always had this on. You fell asleep to it. You could have sung Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds in the 3rd grade in choir without really knowing what it was about.
And yet it was
drugs. It was about drugs. Let me just clear that up for you.
Dang it.
But you know,
LSD, Lucy, Sky,
Does that mean I need to stop singing it as a lullaby?
You may need to stop doing something, but singing it is fine. Now, here's the thing. These songs are so much of a fact of life that it's hard for us to hear them now the way the world did in 1967, and people were blown away. Here's something that happened. Radio stations played this record front to back. They'd play one side, they'd flip it over, and they'd play it again, and they'd do this over and over again. And this is in the days when radio didn't play songs that were longer than 3 minutes. You had to edit your stuff down to get it on the radio. It was unheard of.
And that is because not only did it give birth to a new way to record albums. I mean, without Sgt. Pepper, we wouldn't have Dark Side of the Moon and, you know, The Wall and, you know, those bands that, you know, said, I want to try to replicate what these guys have done. But it also gave rise to A&R radio, which is essentially, you know, we're going to play, you can't just play Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds without having all this other music there, because it is what came to be known as a concept album.
AOR, album-oriented rock. That was an FM radio format that wasn't hit-driven, where you could dig into the deep cuts on side 2 and play the long song and, you know, really make a lot of older brothers happy. All of that starts here. This is a turning point for the Beatles. The Beatles, up to this point, they weren't just live performers. Let's call them pop performers. They're making pop songs, and McCartney has been very explicit. This is where we stopped being performers and started being artists. They weren't going to be on stage anymore. The studio, the place they created their records, became the stage. This album starts with the sound of an orchestra tuning up and people chatting and applauding. This is what they're going to give us now instead of a live performance. Conceptually, that's what this is about. But it is an artistic turning point for all of rock and roll.
So often art and good art is a matter of perspective. How was this album received at the time?
Well, famously, the New York Times panned it. Richard Goldstein, who also worked at the Village Voice, wrote the most notorious review of this record, where he called it overambitious and dull.
He called it dull?
And you know what? There are times when I'm not entirely convinced he was wrong.
Right.
Compared to the
Even
previous...
John has, in his own way, agreed with it.
Even John dismissed this record at one point, although he also celebrated it. This was a conceptual step forward. Almost everyone got the concept, to be honest. People were very, very excited by this record. People had their breath taken away. And also, this was before we had the phrase or the notion, the whole world is watching.
Right.
That's going to happen shortly, a couple of weeks later, in a global television broadcast where the Beatles will perform a song and debut a song called All You Need Is Love, later in June of 1967. But the whole world was listening. That was a remarkable moment. Globally, youth culture focuses on this record at the time it comes out.
And so I've been tweeting about this. This is my own copy. I have 2 copies, one of which is an older version that I had right after the album was originally released. And just so people can get it, we talk about this as being a concept album, although there have been, again, there's always revisionist history. That some people say this really wasn't the first one. Frank Zappa's Freak Out might have been considered the first concept album. I know.
Who cares?
Right.
And it's not that much. It's not even that much of a concept album when you compare it to something like Tommy by The Who, where the concept carries through the whole record. Right. But there is some sort of concept behind this record.
Right. So it's this band.
They're playing a marching band, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Right.
There they are. They're pretending to be these characters. McCartney thought this was a way of loosening them up and trying different things. Though, to be honest, I don't know that it's more of a concept album than Revolver, the previous Beatles record.
Well, because
which
also
was just as exciting.
It's just you have the first song, which introduces the band.
That's
you have Ringo singing with a little help from my friends, which introduces Billy Shears, and then after that, it's just their music. It really isn't.
There's a Sgt. Pepper's reprise at the end, you know, on side 2. You have the vinyl.
Yeah.
On side 2, there's a Sgt. Pepper's reprise where they say it's getting very close to the end. And of course, you know, this famous cover.
The cover is amazing. I mean,
this collage photo, everyone famous in the world behind them, Monroe, Marilyn Monroe, Albert Einstein. But you can see a little car somewhere going over the edge at the bottom. Yeah. And this is part of what gave rise to the Paul is Dead.
Paul is dead.
You know, Paul was supposed to be, they had to be Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band because there was no Beatles anymore. Anyway, I spent a lot of time in 3rd grade.
So did I. I was telling Anne-Marie before this, I spent so long, this was before the internet, trying to figure out who everybody was here, you know, Marlon Brando, Sonny Liston, Marilyn Monroe, and to this day, you pointed out people that I actually hadn't noticed, even though I'd studied this forever.
I spent no time going through this, the cover of this album. I like the songs, and I consume music like the vast majority of people, not like Vlad.
Right.
So, you know, every anniversary, sort of a new version of this comes out. This is the 50th anniversary one. For somebody like me, who just enjoys the music, am I going to notice anything different about this, or what's different about it?
Well, here's what's different about it, and you might notice. The casual listener might notice. Back in 1967, there was such a thing as stereo, but it was not the dominant form. Mono was the dominant form. The Beatles spent 3 weeks working on the mono mix of this record and then handed the stereo mix over to George Martin and their engineer, Jeff Emmerich, who knocked it out in 3 days. The stereo mix is the one that we all grew up with. It's what we know. It's not necessarily the way this was meant to be heard. Do we care? only if we listen to this new mix that George Martin's son Giles has done. He's done a new stereo mix. You can find it if you go out and buy a new copy of the record, but if you're a streaming user, if you use Spotify, Apple Music, you can hear it there as well, and it's exciting. It's a new way of hearing this music. It's a new way of experiencing it. It's a little bit like somebody threw some bleach into the wash. The colors are brighter and bolder.
Okay.
The drums and bass are louder. There's more separation in the instruments. You can hear details that you didn't hear before, and I kind of think you'll notice, even if only you notice, gee, that sounds a little louder, maybe a little more fun.
Right.
It's worth checking out. It's exciting.
I feel like you're going to be getting some late night tweets
Yes,
from Vlad
or just
as he listens to
even
the
an
two
email.
versions.
I get a lot of late night tweets. I want to see, you know what I really want to see? I don't know, I'm sure you follow him on Instagram and you have seen him playing in his band. I want to see Beatles rehearsal photos from this weekend's rock session.
We do a lot of Beatles. I'm always pushing for more.
There we go.
This isn't, for those listeners, and if there's anybody out there who hasn't listened to this album, go out and either get it on Spotify or iTunes or however you listen to music. The vinyl version is amazing. We haven't even talked about A Day in the Life, one of the great songs of rock history, but it's real pleasure to have you to talk about this because this is such a seminal moment. Love it or hate it, this album definitely changed the way that people listen to music. And Joe Levy, we love having you.
Good to see you.